Lowcock, I'm the chair of the independent inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thanks for joining us again. Could you please tell us your name and your role?
My name is Nathan Edwards and I am the current chair of the Sheffield Street Tree Partnership.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much for coming today. As you know, there's a couple of things I say at the beginning of all these sessions. The first is just to make sure you're aware that this is being live streamed and will be recorded and then made available to people afterwards, and that you're happy with that. And the second is we have to be careful in these discussions I have with people that we don't inadvertently defame or libel anybody or bring into the public domain information that should be kept private. If I were worried, which I don't expect to happen in this case, that we were heading into that territory, I would have to alert you to that, and in extremis we would have to curtail the hearing, just to check you understand all
Yes, that's fine. Understood.
Brilliant, thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say by way of introductory remarks?
Only that whilst I'm Sheffield born and bred, love the city, the reason I've taken on this role, I've had no involvement in the dispute, working for or with the council or Amy, and so my only involvement in the process has been very recently, since I took on this particular role.
Great. Could you tell us a little bit about your sort of professional background, and tell us a bit more about your role with the Street Tree Partnership?
So I am a chartered landscape architect. I've been chartered since 2005, got to remember. Graduated from Sheffield in 2000, and I run a small business across Leeds and Sheffield, which is a landscape architectural, urban design and master planning business. And so my particular interests are inherently environmental, and particularly the opportunity for bringing people together with nature and their environment. In addition to that, I've been elected to the Landscape Institute as on the advisory council, so I work within the profession at a national level. And I have a series of other hats. I'm part of the steering group for the Nature Recovery Sheffield. I'm the chair of a local community garden. And I sort of teach and work at the university on occasion. Great.
And just tell me a bit about how you came into your role with the Street Tree Partnership and why you were interested in doing that.
It wasn't something I'd heard a great deal about. I was obviously aware of the troubles, the dispute, just being a Sheffield resident. Too busy running a business to do anything about anything. And it was only really through my involvement with Nature Recovery Sheffield, which is an organisation or group of organisations across the city, which includes the Wildlife Trust, and is headed up by Liz Ballard, who was the former chair of the Sheffield Street Tree Partnership. And got to know Liz through that forum, and Liz had determined that she was going to step down as the chair, and I think she felt initially that I would be a good fit for taking on the chair. So she explained what the partnership was about. She explained the strategy. I went away and read the strategy, which I think is an exemplary piece of work. And it kind of went from there, really. I lodged my interest, and then the partnership took a view as to Liz leaving as chair and me coming in. And over a period of transition, I then took over the chair in March of this year, so okay. Quite recent, really.
Okay, very good, thank you. And so, what is your assessment of the achievements of the partnership, how it's functioning at the moment? What are your priorities and your objectives for the coming months and years?
I'll answer that backwards, if I may, because the reason I got involved with the partnership in the first place is because the strategy, which I think is a great achievement in itself, is an exemplary piece of work, as I said. And you can see that the formation of that document and the objectives that document has set are quite far-reaching. And two of those in particular are about levelling up west to east across the city, because there's a real disparity in tree planting across the city, and some of the poorer communities really lack the benefits, the health benefits, the environmental and the biodiversity benefits that come with good quality street tree planting. So an objective is to do that across the city, and to increase canopy cover more broadly, and also then all the natural and ecosystem services that street trees provide, which is at the core of what my business and my interest is. So I really saw that I was able to support that, and my real objective is to move that part of the strategy forward as best as possible. I think that there are some challenges that we need to overcome to get to that place. To be able to do that, there are elements of work that are outstanding that need to be resolved first, and I'll come back to those. But I think really the opportunities that the strategy, if it could be delivered in the way that it's envisaged, can deliver are far-reaching for the city. And I think that the partnership are already on a good footing to do that and to deliver that. The various members of the partnership are all clearly very committed to making a success of the delivery of the strategy, despite, I think, that there is clearly still elements of mistrust between various members, and I think that's born out of where this whole process has come from. And I would really hope that we can move past some of those elements. And I think arguably we're now at a stage for the strategy which is harder in some ways than the actual formation of the document in the first place, because we're now into a place where we're seeking to deliver on the objectives that it sets. And clearly different people have different views as to how we do that, and we meet those objectives. But I think that the right people are in the room currently to meet the objectives, people who are committed to it. And I think that what you can see evidentially from where we are, even since I've joined the strategy, the latest annual report that was published not long ago shows that I think of the 31 outcomes, more than half of them are in process, 5 of them are complete, and I think only 10 of them are not started. So it's moving, which I think is the most important part of it. And quite recently, you'll be aware that Sheffield was awarded a Tree Cities of the World status, I think one of only 19 in the country. It's got a PEFC endorsement for a Trees Outside of Forests certification, which is in process. So there are things that are already happening that are evidential, I think, of a strategy that is forward-looking.
Very good. Thank you very much. So at the beginning of what you just said, you mentioned some outstanding issues, and we'll probably come back to them. But could you just give me a first sort of summary of what you see as some of the outstanding issues basically inherited from the dispute, if I've understood you correctly, are?
Well, some of them are inherited from the dispute. I think those are just inevitable tensions that exist between people who were diametrically opposed at one point and are now working together to seek to deliver against a strategy. We are looking to overcome some of that. There's inevitably elements of mistrust, partly by calling it out. I think it's important to call it out, and my role as a chair is to call it out, so that it's not something that just sits kind of under the surface. We had an away day last May, quite early from my point of view, coming into the process, which was very good, very cathartic in many ways, and I think actually having face-to-face opportunity is a good way, and an intense day, where you take up a whole day, is an intense way of actually getting people to really debate issues and to get things to the fore. Meetings on a regular basis that are on Zoom or what have you can only ever kind of skim the surface of something. You need to be face to face. So I think the fact that COVID is now enabling us, is past in some respects, and is enabling us to meet. My intention going into the next year would be we have an away day in the spring and away day in the autumn, to make sure that we've got some really good opportunities to meet, and that every third meeting will be a face-to-face, so that we can start to build those relationships within the partnership. I also think that as elements are progressed inherently with momentum, you can move past troubles. But that's not to say that there isn't still some elements of kind of silo mentality between different agencies within the partnership. It's something we probably will come back to, but one of the things I would also like to do is to expand the voice within the partnership.
Right.
I think it's very important that the partnership is independent of the council. It's not the council, it's not Stag, it's not any one party, it's its own entity. And therefore, we do need within it a range of independent voices that can balance some of that argument so that consensus can genuinely be built and you don't end up with a one side or another consideration. So it's absolutely imperative that the Wildlife Trust, the Woodland Trust and so on are members and active members of the partnership.
Okay. Some of the outstanding issues also, I guess, relate to the fact that there were some roads in the city which haven't been covered yet by the Streets Ahead programme, some of which, Sheldon Road for example, are not in fantastic state.
Indeed.
And you sort of inherited a bit of a role in working out what to do, right?
That's right, yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge we face currently, because clearly until we can get to increasing canopy cover and all those other good things, we do need to deal with the CIP.
Right.
And I think that I've referred to it in the partnership before as a bit of an anchor.
Right.
And if we're a ship, then that's the thing that's preventing us from moving forward.
Right.
So the focus at the moment between where we are now, we've actually got a meeting tomorrow, and then into the first set part of the new year is really to look at each of those streets in turn and try and move them forward to a point where they can be consulted upon and developed into a programme.
So my next question then, picking that up, is essentially what additional support you think would be desirable from the council to kind of maximise your ability to make the partnership as effective as possible, including dealing with, if you like, the legacy issues as well as that longer term agenda you described.
Well, going back to your previous question about what are some of the difficulties, I think resource is probably going to be the single biggest issue beyond that sort of sense of mistrust. I think the mistrust point will dissipate, I genuinely do. But resource at the moment is the one thing that will inevitably lead to inertia, and inertia means that we won't achieve against the strategy. Nikki Rees, who is the partnership manager, she's excellent, her support is excellent, but she is only part-time on this. She's split between two different commitments, the tree strategy and other commitments within the council. So I think that there is a genuine lack of committed resource. I think Nikki's committed resource is fantastic, and she's very dedicated to the strategy and its delivery, but she can only give so much time. So I think that often she feels probably that she's picking up elements that she needn't do. I think committed resource from the council side is particularly for the CIP process, is only part of the equation. I think more of the issue lies with Amy on the CIP side because of the need to design through the streets and work through what's technically possible. And that side of resourcing is also something which I think Amy equally dealing with the whole Streets Ahead programme. The tree part of the programme is only a relatively modest part. So they're dedicating resources all over the place, and there isn't necessarily a dedicated resource to the partnership. I think that Carl and Kieran, again, both very committed, dedicated to the partnership, but they themselves aren't the people who are generating the designs and aren't the people who are sort of ultimately enabling the partnership to move forward. They sort of front it, but they're not the behind the scenes people. So I think across both agencies, the council and Amy, resource is clearly going to be a concern, and a concern particularly of mine, given that we're now looking at cost cutting and so
Yeah.
on, and if that was taken from the partnership, it would really hit hard.
Yeah.
The rest of us are all volunteers. I'm a volunteer. The Woodland Trust, the Wildlife Trust, and so on. We're all volunteers. We give of our time freely, and so equally we're constrained with what we can achieve. My biggest concern, therefore, is that does lead to inertia. Ultimately, I think if there was the opportunity to ring fence and safeguard some additional resource, that would only be a benefit.
Very good. Let's just explore that a little bit more then. So is this partly about the adequacy or otherwise of resourcing of things like tree inspectors and tree wardens by Amy? But it goes beyond that from what you've just said. It's about other resource which could be put to work to develop solutions to the legacy issues on places like Sheldon Road. Or are there things beyond that as well at a more kind of strategic leadership level, do you think, on this resourcing question?
I think the point of tree inspectors is an interesting one, because I know that the tree inspectors work incredibly hard. They do a great job. I'll put that out straight away. But there's only 2 of them,
Right.
covering the whole city. So their workload is quite significant. Amy had previously had more people in post,
Right.
and I believe that post has been vacant now, possibly for even a year.
Mm-hmm.
So there is clearly a workload backlog for the 2 that remain, and Amy hasn't been able to, for whatever reason, staff up the tree inspectors. And I think ultimately the tree inspectors are, as I understand it, and this is only my view, fairly full-time on what they need to do on a day-to-day to keep trees, to inspect and to keep trees safe, and ultimately identify which trees need works or felling. So to ask the tree inspectors to take on other responsibilities, like the tree warden scheme, for instance, is a big ask, and clearly not something that I think then that Amy are genuinely able to fully and wholly resource in the way it should or could be resourced. I think the point about the designs for streets that need resolution is an immediate issue, because clearly once those streets have been worked through, then that particular backlog is passed.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the resource to do that is clearly not wholly there at
Right.
the moment. And I understand that is because that particular resource is spread across other issues. Those same designers will be designing works for streets that don't have tree issues. So equally, again, if you look across the whole city, there's a lot of works being required, and those streets that are in the CIP are only a relatively small component of that.
Yeah.
Strategically, the partnership already benefits from 2 heads of department, street scene and highways, being involved. And I think that's a benefit. But I think equally both themselves have a wider remit beyond trees. So it would be advantageous, I think, to have another lead within the council who has a more sort of dedicated role to look at trees across the city, particularly when we go past the CIP and into looking at how we increase canopy cover,
Right.
and combining kind of broader benefits of street tree planting. The council's biodiversity net gain, for instance. All these things are interlinked, and somebody who has oversight of that would be a benefit. I think beyond that, I think it would also be a benefit to have some regular touch points with political leadership within the council. So Councillor Joe Otten, who heads up this area, has had the opportunity to sort of sit in and watch a meeting. But I think that there's no sort of there's no to and fro process there, and I think it would be a benefit, even if it was only on a half-yearly basis, that we can sit down, look at what we've achieved, look at what's left to achieve, look at the gaps that enable us to get to that place, and see whether there's political support that can also be brought to bear. One of my concerns is that actually the partnership doesn't really have any legal status. The council are doing it because they think it's the right thing to do, and all the volunteers are doing it because they think it's the right thing to do, and it is. But there's nothing stopping any of those parties just walking away from it.
Right.
It doesn't have a policy status, for instance.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, we may have covered the other, at least a couple of the other things I wanted to ask you already, but let me just check if there's anything more you'd like to say on other things that you think would make the partnership more effective. You sort of touched already on the possibility of expanding it to have more voices in the room, if you like. I don't know if there's anything in respect of desirability of access to additional expertise, or what else would you like to say about that set of issues?
I've said openly to the partnership that I think we do need some additional membership, something that we'll probably hope to look to in the new year. Whilst there are tree expertise on the partnership and some economics expertise on the partnership, both tend to be either embedded within AMI or within STAG. I think that it would be of benefit to have some voices that have particularly tree expertise within the partnership that are independent and so can take a very dispassionate view. Not to say that the partners are sort of one-sided, but to ensure that there's a dispassionate view. We still need to look at how we develop a genuine cost of benefit analysis, so some economic input would be a benefit. There's issues with regard to planning consents and the loss of street trees that fall between camps. So someone from planning would be of benefit, I think, because it's an area within the council that affects street trees but isn't represented. It's all dealt with highways at the moment. So I think that planning representation would be a benefit. But then it may well be that we don't necessarily need to increase membership, but we have a pool of experts that we could draw upon for specific things. That would be a potentially other way of working that. I know that there are lots of people whom I've spoken to are very interested in the partnership across the country. It's being held up as a great model for how cities can look to manage their street trees. And so I think that there would be other agencies who would be interested in being a part to help us get past some of these particular sort of issues and points. An example of that at the moment, for instance, relates to third-party claims to do with substance. There was concern over the transparency of information that was available to the partnership that was contractually sensitive, and the partnership therefore not being able to make an informed decision as to whether a tree should or shouldn't come down. And so we've agreed as a partnership that we will contract a third party to evaluate that material, subject in contract to the council, so that they can report to the partnership independently to say, yes, due process has been followed, the recommendations that you're being presented with are fine or justified. Or equally can go back to the council and AMI to identify gaps that they need to conclude before they can make a decision. And I think that's a positive way forward to an issue that would otherwise be an intransience within the partnership. So sometimes the opportunity to bring third parties in would be an advantage. And I think that also speaks to resource, because another thing that we're looking to potentially look to do is to develop a strategic planting palette for the city.
I see. Which
will help determine what species should be planted where,
right,
meeting both, or working with both the city's character, so that it's not out of place, but also that look towards climate resilience. And no one part of the partnership has the time or resource to be able to do that piece of work. So at the moment, again, a conversation we're going to have tomorrow, we'll be looking at a third party to assist in helping move that conversation forward. So those sorts of things I think are needed and should be considered for the partnership moving forward.
Good, thank you. And again, you've touched on this already, but is there anything else you'd like to say in terms of what additional senior engagement you'd value from the council and Amy? You mentioned Councillor Otten, who's coming for a chat with me later today, but anything else you'd like to say about more senior engagement?
I think it comes back to the point I was mentioning about the fact that the partnership doesn't actually have a status in any respect. And when there will be inevitably competing pressures that come into play this year, next year, with the cost of living crisis and with cost cutting, and into the future with climate crisis, which is not going to get better, I think it's important that the political leadership of the council understand what the partnership is seeking to do. But it's a balance, because the partnership does need to maintain its independence. It can't be viewed as a council vehicle, because it won't succeed.
Right.
And the fact that we do have independent voices, and that it's a bringing together of different voices, is actually one of its greatest strengths. So it's a fine balance, I think, between it being genuinely supported at the sort of management levels within the council, versus something that is wholly directed by the council.
Indeed.
And I think that's a fine line that we need to tread, giving it the recognition. There's been talk, for instance, about making it a statutory consultee. Could be one positive step or way forward, but goes back to the point of resource, because if you do that, then how do you resource that?
Yes.
So, it'll always come full circle, I think, back to the point about resource.
Okay.
I think the other thing that the council can do is it can genuinely support through facilitation of away days. It could support through training. I think one of the things equally that the partnership would benefit from would be partnership, as in cooperative training, because a lot of the members on the partnership, I think, are still learning about what it means to be a member of a partnership, rather than being within a council department and we're still being representative of the council, but in a different context. I think that can be quite challenging for some.
Okay. So, taking all that and kind of standing back, how would you summarise overall the kind of risks and challenges that you foresee for the partnership, and indeed for the Streets Ahead contract, insofar as it interfaces with the partnership? Because the contract's got another 15 years to run.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges will be maintaining transparency. STAG are clearly a part of the partnership, but STAG are not the whole public. And it's important that I hadn't heard of the partnership before I spoke to Liz, as an example. It doesn't have a particularly wide understanding of what we're trying to do. So a broader church, a broader kind of understanding from sort of general public about the partnership's achievements and who we are and what we stand for and what we're trying to do is key. And being transparent in the decisions that we make is key. I think that we need to be absolutely clear as to when we are the decision maker versus a consultee ourselves, because that line can very easily be blurred, and we can get into endless debate about things that we aren't actually a decision maker on. So I think it's quite important that we have a clear understanding of what the partnership is there to do and achieve, and to continually reevaluate that. I think that the main risk will be ultimately inertia and the capacity of those people involved to remain a part of it. And so continually looking to reinvigorate the partnership, making sure, for instance, the chair's role is not something that is endless, it has a period to run, and that the membership is something that has a natural churn will be important, so that there's not an entrenchment of view. Will be important. And I think it comes ultimately back to both the council and Amy's understanding on how they can dedicate resource. that's crucial, really, because the streets, as you say, the streets ahead contracts another 15 years. There's going to be lots of competing pressures and different pressures over that period. That takes us past 2030. That takes us into a period where we may see certain species across the city start to struggle, and therefore pressures on different types of planting increase. Flooding instances, who knows? Ultimately, there's lots of unforeseens in that period of time, and knowing that there's a dedicated resource to the partnership and ultimately then to the city, I think is going to be crucial. And the other point to that is the street tree warden scheme. The street tree warden scheme at the moment is quite fledgling. It has a massive opportunity to outreach to communities and to enable Amy to identify tree issues before they can. But it ideally needs to be partnership governed and not Amy governed. And again, that comes back to resource, because the potential of the street tree wardens, if we get it right, is fantastic. If we get it wrong, it's a real own goal.
Yes. Okay. Really, really good. Thank you very much indeed. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Only that I think that certainly my experience of the partnership to date has been a really positive one. I think that everyone is genuinely trying to move things forward and make a difference. And you see that in the struggles that we have, in the debates that we have. And I would really genuinely hope that the partnership is supported moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That completes the session.